so archaeology, if you go to, for instance, the Millersville University website in our neck of the woods and you say, I want to be an archaeologist, you'll notice archaeology is not actually a major at Millersville. It'll be listed as anthropology. And at Millersville, you could do archaeology, but it's usually considered a sub-discipline of anthropology. And sort of quick and dirty, everything that we do in archaeology, in anthropology, is more with living people. In other words, we're studying people as they live now, whereas archaeology is looking at evidence in the past and then trying to make theses about how they lived in the past. So, as I said, it's usually a sub-discipline within anthropology. But for the dig that you're doing next week, notice that first sentence: develop a strong foundation in research methods, and that's how you're going to do the dig. Quantification is the way you're going to take these artifacts and put them together. Field methods, we want to do the proper way to dig. Remember, people in the past, they thought they were helping us with archaeology, but we'll find out now that they were sort of looking for treasure, weren't they? And they were rooting through everything and throwing everything out, the bones, and then they found a gold coin, and that was good. Well, we know that's not good anymore. And then, of course, laboratory science. So keep in mind, anthropology is what we call in college and in high school, it is the humanities. Archaeology is a little interesting in that there's a lot of science in that. In other words, if you want to study archaeology at college, you're going to have more science, specifically chemistry and soil science and various things like that. Okay, so second on this thing is, what is historiography? So we'll just read that definition there. Though Bethany summed it up nice with her one answer, but yeah, just read the historiography definition there. So keep in mind, with historiography, including your textbook or the materials you have, the person that wrote that wasn't born in ancient Rome, right? They didn't know. It's not first person. But I could write a living history of my time at Ephrata Junior High in 1980-81. Might not be too interesting, but it would be that I would have the knowledge of that. But if someone read that 50 years from now about my years, that's not always an accurate portrayal, because we might have only seen certain things, right? We took certain classes or that sort of thing. So we got to keep in mind, history is constantly changing, and all historians work on what was written in the past. But in many cases, the past was sometimes biased. An example I use, in the 1950s, in South Carolina, the history of South Carolina, the state textbook, didn't mention that African Americans lived in South Carolina, even though they were 58% of the population. So that sounds like I wouldn't want to use that now if I was writing a paper on South Carolina, okay? So that's what we're saying, is just because something was written in the past doesn't necessarily make it more accurate. But at the same time, it could have some things that we want to use. It's certainly worth noting if I'm studying historiography. Okay, so those are, and then our title of our speech is Archaeology, Historiography, and Ancient Rome. So following along with our outline, we're going to just talk a little bit about number 4, you can see, is how archaeological science has evolved over time. Okay, so when we look at historiography, we usually, the first word at archaeology is we use immediatus. So immediatus, it means the root word is immediate. In other words, what were people doing with archaeology in ancient times? So the best example that I have, and this is a king. Do you mind writing this on the board? Yeah, his name is Nabonidus, Nabonidus. Okay, so this is a king. He was known as the last king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So think back to, when was that, September, October, where you did the Babylonian Empire. Okay, so he wanted to establish his dynasty. So he went back in time and actually sponsored some archaeological excavations to prove that his family deserved to be the king of Babylonia. In other words, believe it or not, politicians have often used archaeology to prove certain things. Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany was a prime example. I'm sure you all saw the movie, hopefully, Raiders of the Lost Ark. How many people have seen Raiders of the Lost Ark? Okay, Indiana Jones movies. But anyways, it's a movie and it's fictional, but I mean, Nazi Germany did use archaeology to sort of validate their crazy and outlandish theories on the Aryan race. So people have used archaeology, and that's in the case sort of for an insidious space, but that's what we would do an example of an immediatist. Okay, well, in medieval times, and then going through a period we know sort of as the Renaissance, 200-300 year period in European history. People in this time period, in the 1600s, began to think, hey, what we have in our society, things aren't going so well. They began to look back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and the glories of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and once again, they looked at it through rose-colored glasses, that everything had been great in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and now England in the 1400s is a mess. So they began to look back on those glories of ancient Greece and Rome. In the 1700s, people discovered a very interesting city known as Pompeii. And you'll probably get to that in your class. Pompeii is really famous in archaeology because it was a city, an ancient Roman city that was destroyed by a volcanic eruption. And it covered the entire city in ash. It was a terrible tragedy. Thousands of people died. And then way back in this period, people began to excavate already what happened in that city. And I can remember when I was in 7th, 8th grade, National Geographic did a 3-part series on the ruins of Pompeii. And I guess ever since then, I've been interested in that. Keep in mind, one of the goals of history is no matter how old you are, if you're walking into a doctor's office when you're 50, I'm hoping, and I'm sure your teachers hope, that you pick up National Geographic, rather than some of the other magazines that are there. Learning is something we do for our whole lives, and we're really never done. Next, I know you just did Egyptian archaeology. So most Europeans were famously ignorant on Egyptian archaeology until Napoleon invaded Egypt. Napoleon was a general, later emperor of France, and fought battles around the world. And when he went to Egypt, he took, once again, we don't do this in today's world, he took a lot of archaeological objects with him back to France. A no-no in today's history. Museums are supposed to borrow temporarily things from other museums. But if you go to museums in London and Paris and Berlin, you're going to see a lot of artifacts which, I'm sorry, we can't sugarcoat, were stolen from the Mideast, and that's, of course, something we don't do today. In America, Thomas Jefferson did archaeology. Really interesting, if you want to look at this, he, once again, not trained, but far be it from me to criticize Jefferson's intellect, but Jefferson excavated mounds of Native Americans in his area, and did some amazing things really without any formal training. But all these examples I'm mentioning, you might say did more harm than good. Mesopotamia, which I know you started out with, this was just a mess in the 1840s through the 1860s. People would go, and it's basically treasure hunting. As I said, they would go through mounds, find everything of value, destroy. When you're doing your dig on Thursday, we're going to look at it exactly the opposite. We're going to go slow and methodical so we don't disturb everything. When you have a grid system in archaeology, and they number everything and you find that exactly. I'm most familiar with Pennsylvania Native American archaeology. When I teach Pennsylvania, we do units on Pennsylvania. Then there's a cave in western Pennsylvania that has artifacts dating back 18,000 years near Pittsburgh. It's called Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, and it's really interesting when you see how you're excavating levels. So the famous city of Troy, which I believe you studied in ancient Greece, when that was excavated in the 19th century, at least one thing we found out, there was probably about 9 different Troys, one on top of each other. It'd be the same way if we excavated downtown Ephrata, right? When we start at the street on downtown Ephrata, we got 2018. Believe me, we would dig down a little more, we'd start finding things from the past very quickly. And that's pretty interesting. During World War II, when London was bombed, of course, which is a terrible thing, but for historians and archaeologists, suddenly ancient Roman ruins started emerging from underneath the shelters of 17th century Catholic churches. So once again, you might say the past is always with us. Okay, so that's sort of our medieval and Renaissance, how we've evolved over time. Modern times, and you're going to see modern times when we go to the dig. The thing that most people are familiar with is excavation. And excavation in archaeology is defined as the surgical aspect of archaeology. It's the surgery, and I think that's a good word. Remember, when someone goes in and if you get ankle surgery, you don't want them going in with a chainsaw and ripping your leg apart, right? Because it's very detailed, so we don't ruin things. It's a surgery of buried landscape, and it's carried out with skilled craftsmanship. So Penn State, for instance, has all kinds of digs in the summer that they sponsor. In fact, we've done them at the Ephrata Cloisters a number of years ago, where students can be involved. But once again, it's not a place to be a bull in a china shop. In other words, it's very delicate, and I think that's what delicate's a good word for that. And in modern times, as I said, just recently, I think 6 months ago, there was a big find, and I saw this on National Geographic, where they discovered the remains of a sprawling residence of a Roman military commander right in downtown Rome. Didn't know it was there before. And I guess dating back to our interest in the average people, miraculously preserved were a lot of the bunks and quarters of the average soldier. So that's one way we're finding out exactly what happened in that way. So that modern discovery sort of just reminds us that if you want to do archaeology, your work will never be done. So there's plenty of jobs. We'll never enter with that. Okay, so we'll move over to historiography over time. Back to immediatus. You know, when people were writing things, they were done for specific purposes. I don't know if anybody you'll talk in the class a little bit about the Aeneid. The Aeneid is the great epic of Rome, whereas the Odyssey and the Iliad are the great epics of ancient Greece. I can probably talk a little bit about the Aeneid, written by Virgil. It's not a history, but it was commissioned by the emperor. So if someone pays me to write a book, if a U.S. senator says, "Hey, John, I want you to write this book about me," and I'm going to pay you lots of money, and if I don't like it, I might kill you, I'm going to probably write a favorable book. So keep in mind, the Aeneid is a history of ancient Rome, but it also incorporates founding myths. And remember, every country has founding myths. And once again, that's okay. I mean, we learn things about George Washington that I could say might be, partially true or apocryphal, which is an interesting word. That doesn't mean that it's not right and good. I mean, everybody has a founding myth. And in a sense, that's sort of where historiography really began. Well, in medieval times, people began to, and this is particularly from a Christian perspective, there's a famous English historian known as Bede, and that's, interesting name, B-E-D-E. He was a Christian and a monk, and he started beginning to write histories of England. So remember, he's writing in medieval times, but in pre-medieval times, England, of course, wasn't Christian, it was pagan. So he wanted to write a history of England where he looked back in England's past and found examples of Christian activity. In other words, trying to make the case that this had always been what England was about. So once again, sort of the political use, you might say, of history. Okay, so modern times, if we can put up Edward Gibbons. I think you'll talk about him in the class. Edward Gibbons, if you ever study history at college, is one of the most famous historians, one of the first you run into. Edward Gibbons, wrote in the 1700s. He was an English historian, and he wrote a book called The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. So, whereas today as historians, whereas today we don't necessarily take a lot of what Gibbons has to say as fact. Now, 40 years ago, this book had a lot of staying power. It's pretty good if you write a book and it's sort of the gospel for 200 years. But Gibbons made a lot of theses about why Rome fell. And it's interesting, there's a lot, when you're a historian like myself, when I go to a wedding, people often just come up and say, "Yeah, hey, why did Rome fall?" As I'm sitting there eating the shrimp cocktail.